In this video, we're going to talk about configuring the LightNap backend. We're starting off here in the repo because it's a good place to get a link to our documentation site, under which the Getting Started section has a lot of good content for configuration. And in fact, it's almost all backend configuration. So we'll start off with this application configuration link, which is, a term we use quite a bit in Overload all over the place. So just kind of bear with us here. So application configuration is generally done for .NET apps in the appsettings.json file. And we'll go into that in 1 second, but I just want to point out that in the local development environment, you use appsettings.json. When you go to production, you'll typically want to put those in a more secure place, especially if you have to, if they're things like API keys or database connection strings, in which case, look at your platform of choice. Like if it's Azure, you'll want to work with app service environment variables or Vault or things like that. At this time, there's 5 things you'll configure on the server side. One are the generic application settings that have to do with things like cookie timeouts and stuff like that. The second one is the database you want to use and the connection string for it if necessary. The third thing is the provider you want to use to send email. And then you'll want to be able to configure your JWT stuff, which is relatively straightforward. And then finally, you'll want to do seeding of administrator accounts. So we'll start off here in the order that they're in, and I'm going to switch over to the code because we might as well just do this directly in source code. So the file you'll be dealing with is appsettings.json, which will be in the end user, or rather in the executable part of the project. So there's really 2 of these here. One is in Web API, which is your website and the app that you're running that has the endpoints that will be connecting to the database and doing all that work on behalf of your user. And then if you have anything like this maintenance service console app, things like that will need to have their own, there'll be some configuration you'll have to do there for app settings so that it makes sense so that they know how to connect to the stuff that they're working with. In this case, the database, data source, and so on. So for this Web API project here, we'll take a look at this app settings. And I also want to point out that if you're not familiar with .NET development, when you run in debug mode, it's considered a development environment, the word development, which means that if there's an app settings.development.json, it will apply that as the last step in looking at your settings. So this app settings.json, you don't want to put any secrets in this because this is going to be part of your code base and things that you'll commit to your server. So if you're local and you want to have like a special connection string or some kind of like API keys or stuff, create an app settings.development.json. This is already excluded by our get ignore. I mean, double check that for sure before you commit, but it should be extended. And then you can add extra things in here that overwrite the features that are defined in here. So in this case, like I'm going to change the database provider to be the in-memory provider. And then what this will enable us to do, just have to make sure the JSON's valid here. So what this will enable us to do is to use the in-memory provider so we don't have a persistent database between debug sessions. This can be useful depending on your development circumstances. I like it for working with data models before I finalize them so I don't have to do lots of migrations along the way. So anyway, the first thing we talked about were the application settings. And the application settings are the details that are a miscellaneous bag of things that associate with your app. So first one here, automatically apply EF migrations. This says that when the application loads, do you want it to go ahead and try to apply migrations if there happen to be any available? So we have an initial create migration, but then maybe you'll add like a products entity with a table. And so you'll have to create a migration for that. Now, if you go to run this in a production environment or really anywhere you go to run this, if your database is not updated to the latest migration that the data model is using in Entity Framework, then it'll throw an exception and exit. So what you want to do is you'll need to migrate forward the database before you can use it. And generally, depending on how sophisticated your process is and how complex your app is, you'll either want to just automatically apply the migrations just to make it quick and easy, or you'll want to have like a team and a whole process around that to be very careful about those migrations. We just give you the option here to have it done automatically because a lot of .NET developers have written code that checks for the automatic and does all kinds of stuff, and you end up jumping through all kinds of hoops. So that's just built in here. And again, it also does it only if it's a relational database, because non-relational databases, the only one that I've ever worked with is for Entity Framework is the in-memory provider, and it just you can't apply migrations to that because of the way it works. So that's just done there. So the next one we'll talk about is log out inactive days. This just means that if a user hasn't been seen for that many days, when they send their refresh token up as part of an HTTP only cookie from the client, If it's been at least this many days since that was issued, then it will be invalid and the user will have to log in again. That's all it really is. In this case means like if we haven't seen a user for 30 days, we ask them to log in again. You can make that as long or as short as you want. But the refresh token is what's used to request an access token. So that refresh token lives in the HTTP cookie, meaning that no other site, nobody has access to it besides the browser, only when the browser's making the requests. And then the first thing it does on load is it requests an access token. So the access token is what's used against all the APIs. And so if it loads up when the app or the site load, they make that request. If it gets rejected, they tell the user to log in. Otherwise, they have the access token to make requests. There's really not really a reason to make that much shorter unless you have a specific reason for needing people to time out sooner. If you're looking at requiring two-factor for new users, you can set this to true. Of course, you'll want to also set up a way for them to get it, which we'll get into email configuration in a second. Then beyond that, we have this site URL route for emails, aptly named. This is just the URL to include route to use in emails that are being sent out from the server app. So the server app doesn't necessarily have a way to know where it's running from, especially if it's running in the debug environment. It doesn't necessarily know that the client has it. And we don't want to trust data that's given to us from the client. So you just hard code in here as part of your configuration what to prepend the URL paths to for emails sent from your site that have links back to your site. So that's just done here. Pretty simple. It's something you can override in different deployment settings. And then finally, use same site strict cookies. Generally set this to true, except you're working in the development environment where you're going to be loading the app from 4200, from localhost 4200, but then it's going to make REST requests to localhost on a different port. This just means that when those requests go up with the refresh token, it'll be included as part of the HTTP cookie because you won't have a strict requirement for same site. If you set this to true, then in the local development environment, it's not going to work. Again, this is just one of those things to be aware of as you do the development process, because things will just not work and you won't know why, and you have to look and track the cookies being sent back and forth and realize that it's effectively being rejected when it's received by most browsers. So that's application settings. Now, the next thing on here is the database provider. So database provider, at this time, there's only 3, but we have a couple more in the pipeline for things like MySQL and Postgres. It isn't that these are necessarily hard to develop because they generally are we're using Entity Framework to abstract away all the intricacies of accessing them, but sometimes you have to be careful about things like casing if you want to be able to do case insensitive searches for text fields. And we're just trying to come up with the right strategy to make that as easy as possible for people to be able to build and extend apps, effectively learning as we go. Now, SQL Server, SQLite, and in-memory stuff, these are pretty solid. You just select one of them, and then if you need to, for example, SQL Server, SQLite, you set a connection string, specifically the default connection string. We've got 2 in here, one that's good for SQL Server, one that's good for SQLite, and those make it easy for you to be able to go back and forth or to pick the one of choice. So you'll set your database provider. The next one we'll talk about is email provider because it's here. There's really 2 options at this time. There's log to console, which will just take anything that it's going to send out or just put it in the console so you can see it there. Obviously not intended for production. It's really good for local development because you don't have to send an email. You can see what links are being sent as part of the body of an email. You can see the 2-factor code, password reset, things like that. And then if you set it to SMTP, then you just have to give your credentials here in the SMTP section and it'll wire that up and send them out. If you happen to use SendGrid, which I've used in a bunch of projects and it's pretty reliable, this is all basically set up to work, except you just have to put your API key here, and then it should work. The username for SendGrid when you're making an SMTP request is API key. So that is supposed to be that. And this is where you put your key if you're using it. And then the from email and from display name, those are just the things that are used in order to, when the email is sent, it's just those are the fields for the from email, from display name, just so you can personalize what you're sending out. But you shouldn't have to adjust much more than that. And of course, you can go in and create your own email providers for things like if you wanted to make a SendGrid one that would actually use their campaigns and their other APIs, so you could send more robust. You could use their templatized email infrastructure, or really anyone's, in order to have more robust things. And we will go into the email providers in another video, but that's not really the place here. JWT, you should tweak. it doesn't really have to be tweaked too much, but you should definitely have different settings for the key than what's here. This is a valid key. You just need 32 plus characters for what's used in order to set up the security descriptors that are used for creating the hashes and the signing. So it doesn't really matter what that text string is. It can be anything you want. I would generate a GUID under ordinary circumstances. You could put that in. You'll want different ones between your different environments as well, so you don't accidentally like log in to have like something local in your is something that like a cookie that could actually be read from a development environment in production, and it gets confused and stuff. So just change the key to always be different for every environment. Also, your issuer and audience, typically you put your URL in there, what your domain is. And then expiration minutes is how long you go before the client needs to get a new cookie. To get a new access token, which will get done. And the cool thing about this is all the JWT stuff, like it's all abstracted away. You should never have to deal with the token stuff. You shouldn't have to deal with authenticating users, writing tokens, parsing them on the client. All that stuff is built into the LightNap code base. There's things that are higher level you can subscribe to, like roles and usernames and so on, and logged in status. It's just that you'll want these things to be customized for your particular app. And in the meantime, like if all you do is just change the key, that's good enough for most circumstances. And then the final thing you can configure on the back end is this administrators thing. So this is an array of accounts to create or to set as administrators. So the way this works is the seeder will go through, it'll get this list of administrators, and I'll give you an idea what the seeder looks like. So the seeder, it starts off and it's passed, the first thing it's passed is it sets up a set of roles based on roles that are configured in the app, but we'll skip that for a second. The seeding the administrator users, it receives this thing. Now this actually maps directly, as you'll notice, email, username, password. This maps directly to the email, username, password here. So this is an array of these objects gets created, and then those get passed into the seeder. And then this goes through and it says, okay, it checks to make sure that there's some in the list, and then it just iterates the list. It tries to get or create the user. So if the user already exists with the email that's been provided there, email is the high order bit, it'll take that user and then it'll elevate them to be the administrator or an administrator. If the user doesn't exist, it'll create the user and then set them to be admin. Now, another key thing about this is that it doesn't undo that. So if you set up administrator accounts, they get set to administrator, and then you decide you don't want to be an administrator anymore, the only real way to do that is to have another administrator account demote the administrators you don't want. And a user can't demote themselves from administrator. These are just little things we've learned over the years to make it easier for end user processing and usage of applications, is to not allow some of these things. It's a kind of common sense caveats that may come up, but just be aware that if you decide to demote, like if you run the code with this app settings, and it creates this account here, this user is an admin. Even if you delete this and then restart the app and then run it again, it's not going to remove that admin user. So just be aware. But this also provides a good pattern where if you want to do something for like having a moderator role and you want to initialize with some moderators or things like that, generally you don't need to do that. The administrator is the only thing you usually have to seed, just because it can be very difficult to bootstrap that first administrator user. And so we've just done that work in a pretty secure way here. Get back that does this for you. And while I'm here for configuration, let's talk about just the program CS. This is the entry point for the web API for people that are not familiar with .NET. And the key things it does that you'll want to potentially come in and kind of mess around with is we use extension methods quite a bit to sort of simplify this file. So these things like email services, application services, identity services, these all live in this project in this extensions folder. So the application service extensions, this does things like the application services. So these are specifically the core services and token and email services and things that have to be configured for the app to be able to run. So these get, actually the email's not here, but the other ones are. These are the dependencies that are going to be used by the controllers or other things that are used by the controllers in order to be able to serve requests and return them. And so this is all for dependency injection. The other one we have here is, this is to add database services. So this just takes that database provider setting that we had, checks to see what kind of database we're configured with, and then calls a specialized method that knows how to do that. And each of these live in their respective library. So for example, the add LightNap SQL Server extension method will be in the SQL Server project under extensions here. and it just knows kind of what's expected. It knows to get a default connection string here. It'll throw an exception if it doesn't exist. It'll apply the migrations or it'll set up the migrations assembly correctly. So if you're creating support for a new database that's not provided here, you can look at the SQLite or SQL Server ones, and they should provide a good model for how it's done, because all they really are is just that these extension method, or this one extension method, and then migrations that are auto-generated by the server or by the entity framework tools. So going that far, so we've got the add database services, very similar for add email services, and then we've got identity services here. So add identity services is a place you may want to come in to do some configuration, because this is things like being able to adjust the rules about users. So we, for example, set require unique email to be true, because we key on email as sort of the main thing people use for login. So we don't want to allow multiple users to have the same email address. Now you can come in here just, and kind of see, for example, all the other things, like you can say allow username characters. Oh, actually that's really the only other one. There's things like for signing in, like requiring confirmed phone number and email. We're planning to get to that stuff and enabling them as features. We haven't done it at this time, but we hope to be able to make it so that you can require some of these things and use the, just explore these to see what else there is that you want to take advantage of. But out of the box, you don't have to really deal with any of these things unless you wanted to do things. The other one here is password, right? I believe option, yeah, exactly, required digit. You can do all the settings. You do require uppercase, lowercase, number of characters, things like that. So if you have specific requirements you want to implement, you can do that here, and then potentially update it on the client as well. But even if you don't update it on the client, the server will enforce the rules that you have set up for the application here. And it also sets up you won't really have to deal with the JWT stuff, but just be aware it's here. And we'll come in, we've got another video lined up, if it's not out already, which is on adding roles, and that's going to come in and kind of touch on a lot of these different places as well. But for the most part, that should be pretty good for configuration. I don't think there was anything else in here for seating. Oh yeah, one other note for seating administrator accounts. If you leave the password field blank, what it'll do is it'll auto-generate a random password for you. And the idea there is to say, let's say you're responsible for a site and you're going to generate, you're adding a couple administrators. So what you do is you would generate random passwords, so that person can then go reset their password using their email address, and then nobody's ever had access to that account. So it gives you a little bit of repudiation support there, just to make it easier for everyone to feel confident in the integrity of the data. And that exists inside the seeder. If you're ever interested to see, we just append a GUID to the password if it's not provided. So pretty basic stuff there, but that is a tour of how you can configure the back end and just about everything you need for out of the box configuration. At some point we'll extend to support more videos that show other cool things you can do for extending for common scenarios, but for the time being, that should get you pretty far. So hopefully this was helpful, and as always, good luck and good hunting.